Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening. My name is John Zagrodzky, and I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen. Appreciate everybody coming out for this important discussion. So who we have here today is Ed Gentile, who is the town's Director of Public Works, along with Joe Canis from the firm of T & Bond. They're going to present the findings of the flooding study related to Salt Box and East Salt Box and that part of town. So these studies are part of a broader effort that we've charted to try to understand the exact scope, if you will, causes and potential remedies regarding some of the flooding that we've experienced over the years, but particularly with the two storms they're going to talk about in this report from the summer of 2021. The purpose of this meeting is only to cover this particular study and the findings and recommendations for this study. It's not to cover other studies which are not ready yet or not part of this presentation, or kind of what we're going to do overall. The sequence of activities here is to take a look at each one of these studies and then over time try to figure out as a town what we're going to do and what are the best remedies that we should take in a holistic manner to try and mitigate some of the damage and trouble that we've had with flooding in the past. I'll let them decide how they want to run the discussion, but we really appreciate everybody coming here tonight. For those of you on watching on television, these studies, of course, will be made available publicly for your review. And if you have any questions, be sure and ask. You can also contact me. I'm on the town's website. I'll take calls or emails at any time. This is an important topic. Again, thanks for coming.
Mr. Zagrodzky, thank you very much. Folks, my name is Ed Gentile. I'm the Director of Public Works for the town of Darien. I don't know if you've all met me or not, so I'll just make that introduction. Also, Darren Ostafine, who's doing the signing out front, is our Assistant Director of Public Works. And as John has introduced, this is Joe Canis, Principal Engineer for T & Bond. So let's talk about why we're meeting here tonight. We're here tonight to present the findings for the drainage study for Salt Box, and that study only. There are other studies that are being considered and are still underway here in town. Some are completed. Some are still ongoing, and there will be meetings with the public at a later date to cover those studies also. At the end of the consultant's presentation tonight, there will be time set aside for questions from the public on this study, and our consultant and town staff will try to answer those questions for you. So first of all, why Salt Box area? Well, the Salt Box coach lamp area, as we describe it, drainage area, are one of the areas that flooded significantly during 2021 and was also identified as not being located within the 100-year flood zone. That kind of tipped the scale for us to take a look at that. We all thought that that shouldn't be happening in this area, this drainage area. And now this study we started over a year and a half ago, almost a year and 9 months. So why did it take so long? So we started out as a straightforward drainage analysis on a drainage area that we had well defined. It turned into a study that required more thought, requiring the impacts of future flooding, increased intensity, and frequency of storms. So we did take a look at that. We started to take a look at that. Our consultant will take us through that thought process as he goes through the presentation. In addition, we did receive some really good questions and comments from the folks that live at Seagate in that area, where the Salt Box drainage system currently discharges. After reviewing those comments, we did further analysis and inspection. We feel comfortable now that we have a better understanding of the entire system in this drainage area with a clearer direction of the next steps. And those next steps, which start with the design phase, will absolutely include input from the Seagate residents to tap into their knowledge of their neighborhood, as well as the folks that live in the Salt Box coach lamp drainage area. So all are going to be involved in this drainage analysis as we put together the final product for construction. Okay, the presentation is a little long, but it's detailed and educational. So please be patient and hold your questions till the end, where we'll open the meeting up to the questions for you folks on this drainage study. In addition, the video of this presentation will be on the Channel 9 portion of the town website, and also this PowerPoint presentation. Joe will give that to me, and I will put it on the Public Works section of the town website also, so you can look at it again if you'd like to. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe Canis, and take us through the presentation. Just give me 1 second. Turn the lights down for you. Or just maybe the first one.
That's good, yeah.
You folks see that okay?
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. Also, thank you to the Board of Selectmen and also to the public listening this evening. My name's Joe Canis. I'm a principal engineer with Ty and Bond in our Shelton, Connecticut office. And as Ed said, we've been about about a year and 9 months into the process. So tonight, I want to discuss the findings of our evaluation report. And we have a slideshow tonight. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit about our presentation, what we're going to go through, and a little map to our presentation, because as engineers, we love maps. So we're going to talk about the evaluation process itself, the area that we studied, the observations that we made, the existing drainage system that's in the town roadways now. We're going to talk about our hydraulic modeling, the climate considerations, as Ed had alluded to earlier, our recommendations, and then we'll close it up with questions and answers. So a little bit about the evaluation process. It starts off with data gathering, right? We see what's available, what's in the town records, right? We actually go out in the field to take a look at a few things, to see what the surroundings are, what our constraints are. Then we gather all that information, right? We basically do a desktop review, right? We go through the documents and see what stands out. And then based on all that information that we've collected, we start our hydraulic analysis and we do the evaluation. And at the end of the evaluation process, we come out with our mitigation recommendations. What are the steps that we going to take that will improve the conditions for the neighborhood? So this map shows our study area, and if you're wondering what that shape is, that is, it's based upon the area that contributes to the outlet of the entire drainage system, which is at the bottom of Seagate Road. So that area is about 125 acres, so that area in red is 125 acres. It consists of 239 structures and 7,400 feet plus or minus of mainline storm drainage pipe, so over a mile of storm drains in that area. And for reference, north is to the top. You can see Boston Post Road at the bottom there, and it extends as far north as Pleasant Street. You can see Gardner Street on the west or left side there. And at the lower right corner of the watershed, you'll see that's the Norotan Presbyterian Church, just for reference. So data gathering, it's like collecting puzzle pieces, right? There are different things that we look at. Some of them include the storm sewer maps. Also, we look at the flood insurance study maps that FEMA puts out, as well as high water marks. You know, a lot of the neighbors had submitted to the town photographs that show flooding on certain dates, and that information is very useful for us when it comes to calibrating the model. We also have rain gauge data, right? In order to correlate those high water marks to a rainfall event, we look at rainfall data to see how much rain had fallen on a particular date. We also look at the underlying soils, right? Because if you can imagine sandy soils, they drain much better than tight clay soils. So there are soil surveys that we use for that. There's also flooding photos, as I previously discussed. Our field observations, you know, just going out in the field, you can see, you know, sometimes high water marks on structures or walls or things like that. You could also see which catch basins appear to be undersized. We also look at tidal gauge data. A lot of times you don't need to look at this, but because this storm drainage system discharges to Holly Pond, we need to take a look at that. And then there's also the historic mapping, you know, to see how the area has evolved and changed over time. And that sometimes lends clues as to what is causing some of the current drainage issues that you face. So I'm going to start by discussing some of the flooding observations that have been made and how they relate to high water marks. So the first one here is on July 9th, 2021. This is at the intersection of Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East. You can see there's quite a bit of water at the intersection there. This next photo shows about an hour and a half later, so you can still see, it's quite a bit of water at that intersection. And all that information is useful for us to determine in our model to make sure that it's calibrated, that it actually represents relatively close to actual conditions that happened. Some additional photographs that were taken at Coach Lamp Lane. This is on September 1st and 2nd, 2021. That storm obviously occurred at night, but you could see that there's a couple feet of water in Coach Lamp Lane. And this is actually pretty much, if you walk from Saltbox Lane East straight back, it's in that general area. Rain gauge data. So what we did was, there are various rain gauges around town. There are some that are part of a private weather network, and also here at Town Hall there's a gauge. So we looked at the different gauges in the area and discarded the outliers. Sometimes a gauge is placed improperly or has a reading that doesn't make sense. So we apply a statistical analysis to discard the outlying data. And then what we did was we compared the measured precipitation and duration of the storm, right? So how long, how much rain fell, for how long of a period it fell over, and then we compare it to NOAA Atlas 14, which is basically a guideline that the National Weather Service through NOAA puts out that for areas throughout the country that tie specific rainfall duration with depth and a recurrence probability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So for a 24-hour duration storm in Darien, right, a 50-year storm will deliver 7.4 inches of rainfall. Now, keep in mind that is over 24 hours, and a 50-year storm doesn't mean you have the storm 1 year, you're good for another 50 years. This is more of a probabilistic terminology that they apply. For example, FEMA has been moving towards a percentage chance. So a 50-year storm has a 2% chance of occurring in any given year. A 100-year storm is 8.32 inches of rain in a 100-year period. So that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And then for a 200-year storm, that's 9.4 inches in a 24-hour period. Right, and that has a 0.5% chance of occurring in any given year. So our first significant storm event that we'll discuss is related to Hurricane Elsa that happened in July 2021. Right, and you can see the different rainfall totals around the study area. And you can see, most of them were right around, on average, about 5 inches. You can see there was one that was really low, and then there was one that was significantly higher than the others. So we discarded those for the purposes of the analysis. But that basically equated to a 50-year storm event because it dropped 5 inches of rainfall in a 6-hour period, right? And if you look at the 50-year, right, for a 24-hour, it's 7.4 inches. But by the time you do translate that 24-hour to a 6-hour, it's a 50-year equivalent for that 5 inches of rain. And that has, like I said, a 2% annual chance of occurrence. The next storm event that we also looked at was September 1st and 2nd that occurred during the night. That was related to Hurricane Ida, which was a much heavier rainfall event, which just dumped a little over 7 inches in 7 hours. So that was a much more significant rainfall event. So those are the two key rainfall events that we looked at in our study. Okay. All right. Okay. Apologies for blocking the screen there. All right. And like I said, engineers, we love our maps. And so some of the mapping that we look at includes the flood maps, the soils mapping, again, that shows how well the soil beneath the study area drains. We also look at historic mapping to see the changes that have happened. Topographic mapping, that tells us how the elevation differences, where things drain to, how steep things are. That's also important. And we also look at the historic mapping. So that's the kind of information that we use. We layer that together to develop our recommendations and our analysis. So the first thing that we looked at was the flood insurance rate map. And this is just a section of the flood insurance rate map. You can see Holly Pond in blue at the bottom. And the part of the study area is outlined in red. And you can see Post Road is basically across the lower third of the photograph there. And one of the things that's important to realize about the flood insurance maps is that they represent historic risk. They don't represent current risk, and they don't take into account future risk. So that's something very important to keep in mind if you do look at these maps and interpret them. The other thing is the flood insurance rate maps from FEMA, they only show flood hazards that are associated with coastal or riverine activities from those two flooding sources, not necessarily from urban or storm drainage flooding, right? So, so what this flood map shows, you can see that there is a flood hazard associated with some of the area near Holly Pond, but in the study area, there are no what are considered special flood hazard areas. And most of you know that that area floods, right? But it's not necessarily represented on the firm. And in fact, 30% of all flood insurance claims are filed in low-risk areas that aren't in a mapped flood zone. So just something to keep in mind. We also look at topographic mapping that's prepared by the USGS, United States Geological Survey. And what we look at is look at the area over time. How has it changed? And believe it or not, they have maps going back to 1892 for the area. And that marker there shows the intersection of Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East. And you can see the Post Road, cutting left to right across the map there. But what's interesting is you can see that there's a watercourse, that thin blue line that snakes its way down into Holly Pond. And when you look at the map that was prepared in 1943, you could see that map, you could see that pond and the watercourse are still there, but you can see, some of the development, there's obviously more houses, there's more streets, so obviously some developments happened. But then when you go to the 1951 map, the watercourse disappears. So what we find a lot of times in doing these studies is that in areas where watercourses or wetlands have been filled, some of the drainage issues persist. Another resource that we look at are aerial photos. This particular photo is from 1934. It's from the State of Connecticut Library. And some of the features I did want to point out on here are the watercourse from Du Bois Street, which is labeled there as 1. And at number 2, you can see that small pond that we saw on those USGS maps in the previous slide. And then the third one is that watercourse that goes down to Holly Pond there. You can see that in the dotted blue. It crosses the Post Road and then discharges to Holly Pond. Now, fast forward to 1965, you see quite a few things have changed. Obviously, for one, there's more development. And you no longer see that watercourse. All you see is a small remnant of a watercourse that runs behind the houses on Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East. So we supplement the mapping that we get, the online resources, the photography, the USGS maps with field observations. Now, this is not to be confused with a detailed field survey, which would be the next step in the design. But this is just to confirm certain things for the concept study that we put together for our evaluation. It's also intended to fill in some of the data gaps that we identified in our initial desktop review. Like, for example, structures that appear to be missing from the mapping. Right? We send somebody out to take a look. Sometimes we'll open a few structures just to confirm connections and pipe sizes. And then in certain areas, we'll need to know the slope between two pipe segments, between two structures. We'll send somebody out to measure down to obtain the depth of the pipe. That way we can calculate what the slope between the two structures is. So the existing town drainage system don't worry, I'll go through this in more detail. But first is what you see just came up on the screen in green. Those are 12-inch pipes, all right? And then, and typically storm drainage design, right? You want your pipe diameters to increase, right, as you work your way downstream. So keep that in mind as I go through this, right? So in blue, we have 15-inch pipes. And then the next dark blue are 18. Then you got a little segment of 24 there. And then we have a segment of 30-inch pipes. And then we have some 36-inch pipes. And then we also have two sections of channel, right? We have a section of channel behind Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East. And there's another section of channel that is on the west side of Seagate. One thing I do want to mention is that we did not do a detailed study of the pipes in Post Road. Those are state maintained, whereas the pipes that you see here on the screen, they are town maintained. We did account for the flow coming from Post Road into the drainage system, but we didn't do a hydraulic analysis of the pipes themselves. So one of the things that's pretty clear here is that you have some larger diameter pipes that go into small diameter pipes. So we'll actually go through these, and we've, just looking at this, we did find some areas that we thought warranted some further observation, or that we thought were of note. So the first one actually occurs in the northwest area of our drainage system, and what you see here is on the right are the topographic lines, right? The closer they are, the steeper the topography. And what you see here, right, we're looking at Gardner Road. At the top there is Pleasant Street. There is an enormous elevation difference between Stanton Road and Gardner Road. And one of the things that makes that of note is that the steep slopes, right, they speed up runoff. Right? It makes sense, right? The water coming down the hill comes down a lot faster, has a lot more energy as it flies down the hill. And that momentum can cause the runoff to bypass catch basins. So instead of going into a catch basin as it would on flatter terrain, sometimes it jumps the catch basin, goes down to the next catch basin, or even jumps the curb if it has enough momentum. So that's something to keep in mind. The other area that we highlighted is down at the outlet at Seagate. You can see Holly Pond, that little blue finger that sticks up. We have a 36-inch pipe that comes down Saltbox at the top, and then transitions to an elliptical 29 by 45, which is essentially a 30-inch pipe equivalent. And then it hits a junction chamber at the intersection of Post Road and Seagate Road. And then it flows into the channel under low flow or high level flow, continues down straight down Seagate Road, which is kind of an unusual arrangement. You typically don't see that. It appears that the purpose of this whole arrangement was to keep that existing channel hydrated. And we'll talk a lot more about that later in the presentation. Another area that we looked at was the intersection of Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East itself. There are a couple things that are going on here. What you can see there in purple is there's a very short segment of 24-inch pipe that links together two 30-inch segments of pipe. Right? There's also a portion of the Saltbox Lane East drainage system that discharges into the swale. You see that in the green. Now what happens, because the pipes in Saltbox Lane are under capacity, what happens is as the water starts to build up at that intersection, it starts to flow into towards the east and then into that drainage system in green and then into the channel. So it backflows into there. So that causes issues in that area. And then another area that we looked at was an area that's between Saltbox Lane East and Coach Lamp Lane. It's a low area. And it's probably where that pond had been. And low areas tend to collect runoff, but they can also overflow, right? They reach a bowl reaches a certain capacity, then it starts to overflow. Another area that we looked at in more detail, this is the last one that we thought was notable and worth mentioning in the presentation, is the detention pond behind the Presbyterian Church. There it's a 36-inch pipe that goes to a 12. So that obviously an unusual arrangement, but we, through our analysis, we documented that it's not increasing peak flow. It actually controls flow pretty well there. So now we have all this information, we have to start putting it together, right, and building a hydraulic model. And these are basically the steps that we do. The first is gathering the data, right? We delineate the watersheds, we break that whole big study area up into smaller pieces so we can isolate certain areas in our analysis. We build the model, then we calibrate the model, right? Make sure it represents observed conditions, that we can correlate it to a specific rainfall event and approximate the extent of flooding as a result of that event. We document the flooding areas and causes, identify areas that flood on a map, and then we use that existing conditions model as the basis to model some improvements. What would reduce the extent of flooding? Like I said, the first step is divide the study area into subwatersheds. And you can see here we divided, I think, 28 or 29 separate areas. And those are based on branches of the system, right? You can imagine the system as it comes up from Seagate, it starts branching out, and that's what we do. You'll see at the bottom in the pinkish purple color, that's where we accounted for the drainage from the post road. And each of these, what we look at are, to try to isolate certain areas of the drainage system, and it helps refine the analysis, right? You get a better feel for what's happening in the specific branches that make up the system. So what we look at here, right, in each of these areas, we calculate what the impervious area is, right? Because you see in the graphic at the left there, right, under natural conditions, right, undeveloped, right, rain comes down, most of it goes into the ground, some of it you lose through evapotranspiration, and you get about 10% of that rainfall that falls will run off across undeveloped land. But when you start paving things, you start developing them, right, you can see because you're paving, you're cutting off the ability for the ground to absorb the rainfall. And as a result, you're going to get much more runoff, right? So whereas you had 10% in an undeveloped condition, you have 55% or more if it's paved. So we calculated the impervious area in each of those subwatersheds. We also looked at the land cover. Right? This goes hand in hand with the impervious cover, right? We look at what's lawn, what's house, what is forested, because they all have different hydrologic characteristics. As I said many times, we also look at the underlying soil type, right? Is it sandy? Is it clay? Is it somewhere in between? And then we also look at something that's called the time of concentration, which basically tells us how quickly the water in each of those, the runoff in each of those watersheds discharges into the storm drainage system. And that's dependent on slope, right? The flatter it is, the slower it moves. It also depends on what type of terrain it runs over. If it runs over a pavement, it's going to move a lot faster than it would if it was moving over grass or through the forest. And when I say hydraulic model, I just do want to clarify that it's not something physical that we build. It's a computerized model. In our case, we used Autodesk Storm and Sanitary. It was a good fit for this particular study because it allows us to have a large number of nodes, or junctions for manholes. And it also allows us to consider the impacts of flooding over catch basins. So when we have the model, right, put all the information in, right, we run it and we get results. But we have to make sure that these results make sense, right? So what we do is we go through the calibration process, right? And we check against known rainfall measurements and observed high water marks. For example, we know this picture was taken on July 9th, right? We know how much rainfall fell in the area on July 9th. And based on this photo, we also know about how high the water got, right? We can find a map and kind of relate that, that yellow line to a topographic elevation. Right? Some other things, right, that we also have to take a look at. Make sure that we have the tidal conditions right, because you want to make sure that at the very end of the outlet that you set the elevation of the tidal influence properly. Right? You want to, if there's a, if the tide is pushing back, you want to make sure that's reflected in the model. But if it's low, you also want to make sure that the outfall pipe is flowing freely. Another thing that we look at is something called antecedent moisture conditions. Like last week or a week and a half ago, it pretty much rained every day, right? So when it rains every day like that, your soil is going to be saturated, and that limits the amount of infiltration that you'll have, right? So when it rains, if the soil's soggy, instead of soaking into the ground, it'll tend to run off, right? So that increases the amount of runoff. So that's something else that we look at during the calibration process. Or do we have to adjust some of those coefficients to account for ground that's saturated? All right, and so the whole process, how do the model results align? And you go back and tweak the model until you get the correct assumptions in there to replicate the flooding conditions that were observed. So what we're going to now is I'm going to step through the results of the existing conditions analysis, right? And we modeled a bunch of different storm events, starting with a 2-year storm, right, which has a 50% chance of occurring at any given year that produces 3.5 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. And this is an enlargement. You could see basically it covers the Saltbox Lane East area, Coach Lamp Lane in the middle, and then you can see there's some cross-country routes where the drainage isn't in the drainage pipes aren't in the street, but they actually run through properties. And you can see, there's starting from the top left, there's Pleasant, then a line that comes down from Thomasina, and then one that runs basically from west to east that comes from the Presbyterian Church, runs across Patricia Lane, and then across Du Bois Street, and eventually makes its way out into Coach Lamp. So what we found is that the system works for a 2-year storm, which it's a start. But then we also analyzed for a 5-year storm, right? And this is a 20% chance of occurring any given year and produces a little over 4.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. And what you could see, you'll start to see some patches of light blue, right? You see one at the intersection of Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East. You'll see one down on Coach Lamp Lane, and, as well as another further north on Coach Lamp. And then you also see a little patch that's between Coach Lamp Lane and Thomasina. So what we're starting to see is that the system's starting to back up. The light blue color is less than a foot, but you can see it's starting to back up. And we move up to a 10-year storm event. Now we're starting to see some real impacts, right? You're starting to see some additional blue colors in those blue blobs, right? So the darker the blue, the deeper the water is. So now you're starting to see water depths of over 1 feet in Coach Lamp and at the intersection of Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East, and even up on Du Bois Street near Thomasina. And the problem with that is once you start getting over 12 inches of water in the street, it's a challenge for emergency vehicles, and certainly for residents to access their properties. So what you see here are 3 structures which we're calling access impaired. Because of the depth of water in the roadway, if you're in the house, you won't be able to leave, and it'll be a challenge for emergency vehicles to access the property. So now we look at a 25-year storm. Has a 4% chance of occurring in any given year. 6.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. And you can see the areas of flooding are expanding. And you can see there's actually a dramatic increase. Because now what you see are the properties in that deep red color, those structures are directly impacted, right? The floodwaters are up against the house. And the yellow mustard colored houses, those are access impaired because of the depth of the water in the roadway. And you can see there are 6 structures that are directly impacted and 22 that are access impaired. And the 25-year is a typical town design standard for most storm drainage systems. We'll get into that in a minute or so. And then we also looked at the 50-year storm, right? This is Hurricane Elsa, the one in July 2021. 2% annual chance of occurring in any given year. 7.4 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. And you could see the flood areas, continue to expand because of the larger storm, as well as the impacts, right? Now we have 12 structures that are directly impacted by the floodwaters, and 31 that are access impaired. And then the last storm that we looked at was the 100-year storm event. That has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. As you can see, there are very significant impacts. 29 structures are directly impacted, and 41 structures are access impaired. And one of the things to note here is if you look up at Thomasina Lane, is off to the top of the sheet, there are another 16 houses, right? Because Thomasina Lane is a cul-de-sac. Because there's over a foot of water in the roadway that takes up the whole roadway, you're not going to be able to get out or in. So there's some very significant impacts. So some of the key takeaways from our analysis of the existing drainage system is that it only handles a 2-year event, right? And the Town of Darien design standard is a 25-year with a 50-year design for low points in the system. There are multiple choke points, right? We talked about inconsistent pipe sizes. Also, right, there's a lot of talk about climate change, and climate data that we have shows that precipitation depths are increasing, right? Our storms are getting more intense. So what we see here, right, and that's based on current rainfall data, you could expect it on the current trajectory to get worse in the future. But based on our analysis, there's also opportunities for improvement, and we'll discuss how we can improve storm resiliency in the area. So first, a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of rainfall trends. Annual rainfall has been trending upward. We can see here's some records, I believe they're out of Bridgeport, that extend from 1896 to 2021. And you can see in general, the trend has been increasing. It's not, it doesn't appear to be overly dramatic, but there is definitely an upward trend in the rainfall. This is on an annual basis in terms of inches. The other thing that I found very interesting, though, was that the storms are becoming more intense, right? This is a graph that shows the number of days in a particular year where rainfall exceeded an inch. And you could see it's, those peaks on the right there in more recent times, they've been happening more frequently. And one of the reasons for that is tropical activity. What the National Weather Service has found is that tropical storms tend to stay around longer, right? They move slower. You can see on the upper left there, right, the hurricane forward speed in the northeast over time has slowly declined, right? And with that, as these storms move more slowly, they spend more time in the area, and as a result, they tend to drop more precipitation. And you see that in the lower left graph, where the slower forward speeds, it slows as you move to the left, and you can see the precipitation depth also increases. And on the right is a table. I'm obviously not going to read everything in that table, but just to give you a flavor of how the forward motion of storms has changed over time. And if you think about what happened in Texas with Hurricane Harvey back in 2017, the reason why that storm was able to drop so much rainfall was because it just sat over there. It didn't move. The National Climate Report that the National Weather Service put together a couple of years ago shows that New England is trending wetter. And there's a couple different inputs, factors that influence it. They look at emissions, but the general trend is that rainfall and intensity will be increasing going forward. And also, at my level as an engineer, the things that we deal with, right? We based our designs on criteria that's published by the National Weather Service, and that criteria has changed. When I first started in 1994, we used technical paper number 40, which was developed in 1961, and we probably used that, through the mid 2000s, right? As newer rainfall information started coming out. And back then, right, for a 24-hour storm duration, a 50-year, you can see there, 6.5 inches. 100-year was a little bit more than 7 inches. Right? New guidance that was issued by NOAA, it's called Atlas 14, came out in 2015 for this area of the country. And you can see that this storm duration for a 24-hour storm, if you look how much the 50-year, it's nearly an inch, and the 100-year has increased by over an inch. All right, so the other thing to take a look at is the old 100-year criteria is the new 50-year criteria. So that just shows you how things have changed and evolved in terms of designing for rainfall events. So with all that in mind, right, we made a couple of recommendations. Right? We took the model, the existing conditions model. We were satisfied that it relatively accurately captured the areas of flooding. It made sense based on the rainfall events. So then we started developing some recommendations based on that. We looked at areas of what could be improved. So before we go any further, I'm going to talk a lot about pipes and box culverts. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to explain the difference between the two and give you a visual. Because sometimes as engineers, we get too excited about things and we get a little bit too technical. But reinforced concrete pipe, it's standard, right? It's just exactly what you would think it is. It's a round pipe. It's readily available, easier to install, and it has a relatively low installation cost compared to a box culvert. Box culvert, you can see, is a lot bigger, right? You need more equipment to set it. You need more labor. It has a longer lead time, but it provides more capacity than a traditional round pipe. So just keep that in mind as I go through the different options. So the first one is alternate 1A. And we designed this for a 50-year storm throughout, right? So that's the 7.4 inches of rain. And any pipe that you see highlighted here in the heavier line gets replaced. So basically replacing 90% of the pipes in the network. And this is these are the main line. There's also catch basin laterals that connect to these, which will likely also be replaced. But if you remember, the line coming down Salt Box was 36 inch, then it transitioned to a 30 once it got to Seagate because there was that diversion. What we're proposing as the spine of the system is a 3x5 box culvert. So a box culvert that's 3 feet high, right, on the inside, and 5 feet wide on the inside, right, versus what's there now is only 3-foot round pipe. So that's a significant change. The other thing that we did when we looked at this was, for the purposes of these alternative analysis, we assumed that we would direct everything to Holly Pond, right? So that diversion to the watercourse on Seagate, we are not diverting anything into that based on this analysis, right? So we just bypass that whole watercourse system. Some other changes, you could see the pipes in Salt Box Lane East, they changed from about a 30, I believe it was, to a 48. So basically, it's bigger pipes everywhere. And what you'll see on this map also are the heavy dashed navy blue lines. Those are the areas that flooded in the 50-year storm under current conditions. With these improvements, right, you can see that there is no flooding in any of the local roadways as a result of these improvements. So that would be a significant improvement. So another alternate that we looked at was designing it for the typical town standard, the 25-year design storm. And you can see the pipes are smaller, right? We only have one small segment of box culvert to help us get across the post road, right? We want it to be, right, it's connecting two 40-inch pipes. They're roughly hydraulically equivalent. But the reason why we want shorter going across the post road is to avoid utilities, right? Because there's underground electric, there's a sanitary sewer, there's a whole host of utilities that we want to avoid. And by going shorter through there, but wider, that gives us a better chance of avoiding those utility conflicts. And what you see, again, in the navy blue, the dashed navy blue line, you'll see it kind of sneaking its way around. Those are the areas that flood in the 25-year storm. So again, this addresses a 25-year storm, no flooding in the streets. Another alternative we looked at was, what if we designed this for the 100-year storm? And you can see, again, that spine of the system, instead of being a 3x5 box culvert like it was in alternate 1A, it becomes a 3x7 foot box culvert, which is, although it's only 2 feet wider, it is a lot, it's a lot more to install. It's a lot more effort, takes up more space in the roadway. And you'll also see that box culvert in that purple color also gets extended down Saltbox Lane East and then up to Coach Lamp. And that that dashed navy blue line, that represents the area that floods in the 100-year storm. So this takes all the flooding off the road for the 100-year storm event. There was a fourth alternate that we looked at. One of the things that we looked at was, to try to reduce the load that's headed down Saltbox Lane. So what we did was we split the system. You can see it doesn't show up very well here. I apologize for that. But basically, the line that comes from Thomasina across to Coach Lamp, instead of sending that to the west to Saltbox, what we did was we're instead sending it south along Coach Lamp Lane, intercepting everything else that comes from the east, bringing it down to the post road, and then extending a new 48-inch drainage line down Post Road, where it joins back up at the intersection of Saltbox and Seagate and Post Road. So that was another alternative that we looked at. We did this for a 50-year design. And so these are the 4 principal alternates that we looked at. Then during some of our meetings, Ed had challenged us. He said, we have this 50-year design, right? So what if we implemented this 50-year design? What would happen in a 100-year storm event? And that's what this drawing shows here, right? So this is our alternate 1A with a 3x5 box culvert that forms a spine of the system. And you'll see areas of pink or purple, right? Those pink or purple blobs. You can see one at Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East, and you can see one up at Coach Lamp. Those are areas with the 50-year design that would flood during a 100-year storm event. Right, so it is about 18 inches in both of those locations, so there are going to be some access impairments. But when you compare it to the area that floods currently in the 100-year, which is again that navy blue line that's dashed, you can see the flood extents are reduced significantly. And we'll get into a little bit more on that later. We also looked at the alternate 1B, which is a 25-year design. We ran the 50-year storm through that system, and you can see, although there is a reduction in flooding, the heavy blue is the 50-year storm. It does reduce the extent of 50-year flooding, but there's still a significant amount, particularly at the Saltbox Lane and Saltbox Lane East intersection. So we developed a table comparing our 4 principal alternatives, right? So you can see our metrics here on the left, right? So we looked at our design storm, right? We talked about the design storms. Construction costs. Box culverts and drainage improvements are not cheap, especially when you're replacing over a mile of storm drain, right? They range anywhere from $3.78 million all the way up to $7.83. It's a significant cost, right? We also looked at the maximum depth of flood, which we discussed on the previous slides. But the reduction in flood area, right, for a 50-year storm compared to existing conditions, right? The 50-year is pretty much the town design standard, right? Alternate 1A with the 3x5 box, 100% reduction is what our model shows. Alternate 1B with 25-year design shows that the area that's flooded by a 50-year storm would be reduced by 42%. Alternate 1C, that's the 100-year design. Obviously, since it's the 100-year design, the 50-year would work. And then alternate 2, we did not evaluate that. And one of the reasons I want to discuss is why we really didn't explore alternate 2 too much further was because of the cost, and also because of the amount of time that we spent in permitting trying to get this approved, because it would be going down the post road. DOT has a lengthy permit process for if you're replacing lines in their roadway, not just a crossing, but actually, along the length of the roadway. And also the utility conflicts. We'll be hitting utilities all the way down the length of that. So we decided not to pursue that much further. We also looked at the reduction in the flooded area for the 100-year storm compared to existing conditions, right? And alternate 1A, it was a 94% reduction. That's pretty good. Alternate 1B, we didn't evaluate that, right, because it's only a 25-year design. And alternate 1C, that is a 100-year design, right? So that would be 100%. And then we looked at the number of houses that were impacted either directly or indirectly by access, right? So direct impacts, right now it's 12, right? With all of these, all four of the alternatives, it would drop to 0. We don't anticipate any house flooding as a result of backup from the storm sewer. The number of houses that are access impaired, right, under existing conditions for a 50-year storm event, it's 31, right? Alternate 1A, that's 0. For alternate 1B, right, which is a 25-year design, there's 13 houses that are access impaired. So with all that in mind, our recommendation to the town is alternate 1A, which is a 50-year design. And these are some of the reasons why we recommended this particular alternative, right? It meets or exceeds the town design standard, right? So it provides a factor of safety for the future. It's a significant improvement in the roadway flood depth over the 25-year and the 50-year events, right? So the roadways are kept clear for storms up to and including the 50-year event. And in a 100-year storm, flooding is limited to the roadways themselves, right? There's no direct structure impacts. It's a 94% reduction in flooded area for the 100-year event. It's difficult to justify. I believe it was another 600, 700,000 for that next 6%. No residences are impacted for the 50-year storm event, whereas under existing conditions, there's 43 that are impacted either by access or direct impacts by floodwaters coming up to the homes. And in the 100-year event, using under alternate 1A, 13 residences will be impacted. And this is just access only, whereas 70 are impacted in total under existing conditions. One thing I do want to point out, there's always a chance for a bigger, heavier storm than the 50 or the 100 as we saw with Hurricane Ida, right? So if constructed, the proposed improvements won't forever solve the flooding issues that the neighborhood is seeing. There could potentially be a storm event that exceeds the capacity of the system. But the improvements, right, will reduce the frequency and the severity and the duration of flooding. So if and when it does back up, those floodwaters will recede a lot more quickly because there's a lot more capacity in the proposed system. So some other improvements, I spoke a lot about pipes, increasing pipe sizes, but along with that comes some other improvements that also need to happen. The outfall, right, the whole system discharges to Holly Pond. That outfall, the head wall there, needs to be replaced to accommodate the larger 3x5 box culvert. Catch basins, right? The drainage inlets on the side of the road. A lot of those will need to be replaced, right? They'll have sumps that'll improve the ability of those structures to capture debris. If you think about leaves and things like that. So the sump is a space that lies beneath the pipe in the catch basin, right? So that'll improve conditions as well. Also, one of the things that we did notice out there is that there's not a lot of, in some areas, there's a significant distance between inlets on the road, right? So what we'll do is we'll be adding additional catch basins to improve the interception capacity of the water that runs off, especially on Gardiner and Saltbox. Some catch basins may need to be double-sized. I don't know how many of you have been out to the Abbey Intervale neighborhood. The town did a drainage improvement there probably about 7, 8 years ago, and a lot of the catch basins were increased in size from a single frame to double to improve interception capacity, and that usually happens at low points. So that's something else that we'll be looking at here. So one of the questions you might have, okay, so why not go even bigger, right? Why not, get the biggest pipe that you can in there? And there's a couple reasons why you wouldn't want to do this, and including expense. But a pipe needs a minimum amount of soil above it to support traffic loads, right? So you can't really raise a pipe anymore. You'll have to go down, right? And as the deeper you go, the more expensive, the more labor it becomes. But you also, as your pipe gets deeper, right, your pipes also get flatter, right? And that reduces your hydraulic capacity. And by the time you get to the bottom of the system, at the outlet at Holly Pond, you might be too low. You might be, permanently below the normal water surface of Holly Pond. It also increases the potential for utility conflicts, and I have a slide that better illustrates that. So what you here look is like basically a cross-section view across the street. You got two houses. You can see you have a car on the street. And right now, right, the whole area serviced by sanitary sewers. You got the sanitary sewer in the middle of the road. And each house has a lateral that connects its internal plumbing to the sanitary sewer, right? And in most cases, right, because the storm drainage pipes are relatively shallow, they're only 2 feet below grade, below street level, right? That existing storm drainage pipe sits on top of the sanitary sewer laterals. But if you go with a larger pipe, right, because you can't go up, right? You already have that minimum cover. You can only go down. What happens is you have a conflict, right? So the bottom of your pipe runs into the sanitary sewer lateral. So now, not only are you replacing the storm drainage pipe, you're also replacing the sanitary sewer laterals as well. And in some cases, you may not even be able to make it across, so you have to come up with some kind of weird pumping system for this house on the left, or you might have to run dual sanitary sewers down the street. So these are all things that we look at. So that's why we generally try to make the pipes much larger than what they are. So another, I'm sure a lot of you know about stormwater detention. If you have a pond, right, you can hold water on site and then slowly release it over time. So why not use that low area between Coach Lamp and Saltbox Lane East as storage? Well, first of all, it's private property. The town doesn't own it, so that's one good reason not to use it. But only a limited portion of the watershed can drain to this area, right? A lot of the runoff into the system comes from the north and from the west, right, which we wouldn't be able to pipe to this area. But at the end of the day, it has relatively limited storage, maybe 3 to 4 feet deep at the most. And then the other thing is, I've run into this on a project in Bridgeport, is that there's a lot of permitting issues that come with this, especially if this is wetlands. Trying to use wetlands as detention, it's a very long permitting process with DEP. So the other thing that we looked at are what are the potential impacts on downstream properties? All right, so just again, the system was designed to do no harm, right? We're not trying to increase flow going downstream. One of the big benefits of this project is that in itself, it is not creating additional impervious area. Early in the presentation, I said the more you pave things, the quicker the runoff is. Fortunately, in this case, this isn't a development project where we're paving a fresh lot or anything, undeveloped lot, right? We're just replacing what's there in the roadway in kind. We're not creating new roads or anything like that. So there will be no increase in volume as a result of that. The project discharges to Holly Pond, which is a large coastal water body, which is connected to Long Island Sound, which is connected to the ocean, which certainly helps us in this case. The discharge velocities coming out of the pipe outlet will be less. Right now, you can see, right, the ponded water sits on top of the catch basin, so it's exerting force on those pipes, right? So the pipe tends to run faster because it's running under pressure, right? So therefore, those with the proposed alternate, the improvement, right, we have a much larger cross-sectional area in our box culvert versus the existing pipe. So what that does, conservation of mass, is that the velocities, right, we have the same amount of water going through there, but it's going to be, because it has a bigger cross-sectional area, it'll be going through there more slowly, right? So it doesn't come out like a fire hose at the end in a heavy rainfall event. Also, what helps us is at the outfall at Holly Pond starts to widen out, the tidal mixing there also further reduces the velocities. So I had mentioned several times that there's a watercourse on Seagate Road, which acts as it basically splits the flow coming from the Saltbox Lane neighborhood. The lower right shows a video capture from one of the Seagate neighbors. It was in the July 2021 storm event. So you can all see that there's also flooding issues down there. And so what we did in the process of going through the town mapping, we found, this is actually a sewer drawing when sewers were extended to Seagate. So what I did was I highlighted the existing storm drainage network in blue. And you can see there that, that irregular shape there and the grayish blue is the existing watercourse. So what happens is, right, you can see the blue arrows that just popped up. That's the runoff in the storm drains from Saltbox, right? You see it comes down Saltbox and goes across the post road. In addition to that, there's also runoff, right, in that pale blue arrow that comes from further east along the post road. This one north is to the left, right? So you can see that runoff in the pale blue with the pale blue arrow comes in towards Seagate as well. And then what happens is there's a splitter manhole right near the intersection of Seagate and Post Road. And what happens there is that manhole splits the flow into two different directions, right? It either heads west towards the watercourse, right, the darker green, or it goes with the lighter green further down Seagate. And then from there what happens is we also have some additional runoff that's contributed by Post Road to the west of the intersection. So that's that orange arrow. There are two catch basins in Post Road that discharge into that watercourse. And then everything rejoins back together again at the intersection of Seagate Lane where you can turn left or right. So a little bit more about that manhole. Unfortunately, actually this came up a little bit better than I thought it would. We found some old construction drawings. So basically it's an octagonal shaped manhole. And what you see here is, so on this one, right, we're looking at the plan view. You can see the octagon on the upper left, right? We're 180 degrees from the previous drawing. So north is to the right here. And you can see that blue arrow shows the flow that comes in from Saltbox Lane from that elliptical pipe, which is the 36-inch equivalent. And then that pale blue is what's coming in from Post Road. And what happens is it splits, right? So what happens first is that the primary direction of flow, right, when it first starts to rain, water starts first flowing in that pipe, that runoff enters a manhole, and it makes a right turn towards the watercourse out a 24-inch pipe. And as the rainstorm continues to build, right, more and more runoff starts to fill that pipe, enter that chamber, right? You got the water that's going off to that 24-inch into the watercourse. Eventually what happens is it builds up to about a foot. When it gets a foot high in that chamber, then it starts to flow down the 30-inch reinforced concrete pipe in Seagate towards the outlet. So at this point, both pipes from that chamber are now flowing. But the primary direction where it goes first is going to be into the watercourse. So some of the things to keep in mind, right? We're not increasing the amount of flow into the watercourse. Actually, alternate 1A, as did all the other alternates, right? That's, let me go back. That dark green arrow to the north, we'd be shutting that off, right? So our analysis accounts for everything just going straight through, right? So we're not contributing anything to the watercourse. Now, there are some reasons why we might not want to do that, right? We want to make sure that we maintain a certain flow for wetland reasons, so that's something we'll have to revisit during the detailed design phase. Right, so right now, with the design alternates, everything bypasses that watercourse. Runoff from Post Road west of the intersection, that pair of catch basins with the orange arrow, That will remain in place. We won't be changing that because it's a state roadway. And like I said, one of our future because right now these alternates, they're conceptual, right? The next phase of this will be to actually design these improvements, right? To be able to put set of plans out to bid, to get approved, permitted, and then out to bid, right? So there's certainly a lot more design that needs to happen. But one of our future tasks is to meet with the residents on Seagate and evaluate what's the right amount of flow to send into that water course, right? Do we open up that manhole? You know, right now it's a 24-inch. Maybe it becomes an 8-inch pipe, right? So, or maybe we change the elevations in that manhole. So those are some of the things that we'll have to take a look at to see, see really what makes sense, and also take a look at, whatever amount that we send through there, how that impacts. There are a couple driveway crossings. I know there's a bridge there. There's also a small spillway. Those are all the details that we'll have to take a look at in the next phase. So in terms of impact on Holly Pond, right, the elevation increase will be immeasurable just because Holly Pond is so large compared to what contributes to it. Like I said, the project does discharge to Holly Pond. It's connected to Long Island Sound. The salt box lane system, right, at the very beginning of the presentation, right, it says 125 acres. But that's not the only thing that contributes to Holly Pond, right? You got the Norotan River that contributes to Holly Pond as well. You can see anything in that orange highlight on the map to the right there, right? A drop of rainfall anywhere in that yellow area that runs off will eventually find its way into Holly Pond. And that area is a little bit over 8,000 acres, right? So the salt box lane system, right, is only 1.5% of the total area that contributes to Holly Pond. Right, and there's also, the tidal impacts, and of course there's a permitting element, right? There could be an extreme high tide, right? We did model it with a, high tide in mind, but, we didn't do an astronomical high tide or anything like that. So there could be situations where the system backs up, and there's really not a whole lot. You're fighting the ocean. Due to the outfall replacement, though, right, because we are replacing the outfall, right, we'll have to do work below the coastal jurisdiction line. That opens up some permitting requirements for the project from both the Army Corps and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. The first thing that we need to do, because we need to go to the Army Corps, is to also go to the State Historic Preservation Office, file a consultation with them. That usually doesn't take too long. Hopefully you don't find anything. But the other thing that we have to take a look at, if you look at the lower right, this is from the Connecticut DEP Natural Diversity Database. And what this shows is areas that have the potential to house endangered and or threatened species. And you can see all of Holly Pond is an area of concern. So when we do develop the plans in further detail, we will have to submit them to DEP for a consultation with the fisheries and their fisheries biologists. Also, because of the work that we're doing below the coastal jurisdiction line, we're replacing that head wall there. We have to get a DEP structures dredging and fill permit. DEP tidal wetlands permit likely. And we also have to get a DEP 401 water quality certificate because we're applying for an Army Corps Connecticut general permit. The Army Corps has a series of general permits that cover different activities. New outfalls in tidal areas is general permit number 6B. So you can see there's quite a bit of state and federal permitting. And typically the process, can be anywhere 6 to 9 months. I would probably say venture would probably be more towards the 9-month end, based on what I'm seeing, especially on the Corps end. So, all that said, what are our next steps, right? So, once the town gives us the green light to proceed with design, right, the first step is to get a detailed topographic survey, right? We actually have a surveyor go out that'll measure all the structures out there. That'll take readings to determine what the elevations are of those structures, not just the frames, but also the pipes, record the size and material of the pipes, also take a look at some of the off-road things, such as the structures that are over that watercourse on Seagate. So there's a 125-acre area to cover, so it's a very large survey area. Next step is semi-final design. Once we have that additional information, we can really develop some of the design details, and as part of that process is where we have the meetings with some of our neighbors to help develop the design. The whole goal here is to be able to get the design developed enough that we can submit it for permitting. You can see the list of permits, like I said, about 6 to 9 months. And while all that is happening, if you remember the storm drainage maps, what we're showing are lots of connections, right, that run not just in the streets, but across properties, right? So in order to make that official, we have to have recorded easements from those property owners. So that whole process is also included. That's something we could do during the permit process. And once we're done with the permitting, right, what we could do is then we finalize the design, get it ready for bid, and then we'd put it out on the street for a bid, and then negotiate with a responsive low bidder, and then you get ready to construct, right? So that's, and we figure construction, just because of the area, the amount of work, we're looking at about 12 months. So, you know, all said and done, you know, from design through permitting to a contract award is about 21 months, and another 12 months on top of that. So unfortunately, these things do take a while. So, but when we do get to construction, some of the things to expect, like I said, about 12 months, excluding winter shutdown period. The way you construct drainage systems, start at the bottom and work your way up. So work will start on Seagate first, cross the post road, work your way up Salt Box, and then branch out from there. One of the requirements is that access to properties has to be maintained at all times. That's not to say you might need, you might have to wait 5 minutes for a contractor to move a piece of equipment out of the way, but they do have to provide reasonable access to your property at all times. The contractor will be required to deploy sediment and erosion controls. This is particularly important because you want, as a town project, you want to set a good example for all your private developers in town. So there'll be a lot of eyes on this project, you know, not only from the neighbors, but also from the town themselves. And some of those include silt fence, you know, things that you've probably already seen, catch basin inserts, and then also turbidity curtains, right? So basically floating booms and possibly a cofferdam. Not sure what form that'll take, but you likely need a cofferdam to achieve the work down at Seagate to replace that head wall. And so that said, that wraps up my presentation, and at this point I'll open it up for questions. Ed, I don't know if you want to handle that part. Thank you.
Wow. I did say it was a little long, but very educational. I think Joe did a fantastic job. I went through these slides a couple times, so I want to thank him personally. We have done a lot of work on this, and particularly because of what had happened and the work that's going to be needed here in these areas to help alleviate some flooding to a level where I'm comfortable saying that we have a good project, and I think we do. We're going to open it up to questions. The microphone's in front here. If you could use that, please, so Channel 79 could hear you also. And if you'll give me 1 second to turn the lights up so that we all can see, and we'll get started with the questions. Folks, when you do come up to ask your questions, if you could please just give your name and address. It'd be helpful for our records. We'll go back and review this later and take some notes. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is John Tibbetts, and we live in the last house on Saltbox Lane. And I have two questions, so I don't know if I should just ask one at a time. And you want to answer one at a time? Should I ask both questions right up front, or you want to answer one at a time?
We'll do it.
Okay. Well, you mentioned briefly a soil analysis, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, because I think the problem I have, and maybe a lot of the houses have, is that the ground just becomes saturated. It can't absorb any more water, and we have water coming at our house like a river on the top of the ground.
Sure, and to answer that question, what we do is, when we collect that soils information, it's the Natural Resource Conservation Service of the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, has a soil survey of every county in the U.S., so there's one of Fairfield County. And in that, they have maps that show the soil types that underlie, areas in the town, in case, our study area here. And what each of those soils has what's called a hydrologic soil group, right? It ranges from A to D, with A being the most porous soil. It drains quickly, to D, which drains very poorly. Most of the soils in the study area, based on that survey, are in the C to D range. So what we account for that in this study, right, what we look at are what are called runoff coefficients that are key to how well the soil absorbs rainfall. And because of the underlying soils that are not great, they drain poorly, those runoff coefficients tend to be higher, right? So that's how we determined, that's how we calculated the amount of runoff that's coming from those particular areas. So, and I would say almost all the study areas, soils are in that C to D, which is poorly draining. Yeah.
Okay. And then my other question is, I just have a lingering suspicion about the pitch of the existing pipe. The intersection of Saltbox and Saltbox East is a low point, and as going towards the post road, from that low point, the road actually goes up a little bit and sort of crowns, and then goes down to the post road. And you mentioned about the conflict with sewer lines going in. Would the system definitely be a consistent descent down Saltbox Lane? Because I have a feeling that it's possible that the drainage pipe actually comes towards the intersection of Saltbox Lane East before it starts again going down towards the post road, because certainly the contour of the land is a hump,
right,
in Saltbox Lane. So.
Okay, yeah, so right, so what happens is
thank you.
Right, both the sanitary sewer and the storm drain in Saltbox Lane, they both generally discharge from Saltbox Lane East south to the post road, right? And there is a slope there. But yeah, you're right though, right? The topography rises, so whereas the pipe is going down towards the post road, Saltbox Lane kind of rises and then comes back down. There's going to be a deeper excavation in that area. One of the things that we will capture in the survey though are those areas, right? We'll take our surveyor will take a measurement at every structure there, so we can see are some of those pipes back pitched. And obviously that's a situation that'll need to be corrected, because when a pipe's back pitched, that really reduces the capacity, that leads to backup. So that's something else that we'll look for in the survey itself. So that that'll be incorporated into the detailed design. Right now, just for the concept level, we really didn't need that level of detail. But when we go to detailed design, we'll need to figure out exactly how those are pitched. But my expectation is that the pipes are going to be very flat if they do pitch. So that's something else we'll have to take a look at.
Hi, Carl Alto, 36 Coachlamp Lane. So I'm in the middle of Coachlamp where the house became red at year 5.
Sorry.
I'm a meteorologist by training. I worked in the Weather Service as a meteorologist and a hydrologist, so I'm pretty familiar with the issues in this report. I thought the presentation was fantastic, and I came up with a similar solution, conclusions. The one thing I would say is that the issue isn't mostly, and this is actually more for the Department of Works and for the selectmen, the issues in Darien, since we're so flat and we're so close to the water, is that it's not so much the 24-hour rainfall, it's the 1 or 2 hour rainfall. My basement, so that water goes into the middle of Coach Lamp, it floods, it goes into my yard, it goes into my basement. My basement floods for an hour or 2. The water on Coach Lamp lasts 3 to 4 hours. So we're not talking about 24-hour here, it's really how much falls in a very short period of time. So I looked at that table, the rainfall reoccurrence table that was on the report, and I focused on the 1 hour rainfall rate, and it's about 1.5 inches an hour. And then I pulled up the observations from the 3 closest reporting sites, Bridgeport to the east, White Plains to the north, and Central Park to the south and west. Since 2000, Central Park has had 1.5 inches an hour 9 times, Bridgeport 8, White Plains 6. We've been recording hourly rainfall rates at Central Park since the 40s. 9 of the top 10 are since 2000. 13 of the 15 are since 2000. So I guess my question is, does your study change if you look at it from a 1 hour or 2 hour standpoint? And mostly my comment is that even though when you look at a chart and the 24-hour rainfall is increasing, the increases in the summertime downpours that we're seeing mostly with hurricanes is increasing at a much more rapid rate than the 24-hour. So.
Right. No, that's a good point, and we discussed this internally, as we were developing the design. The reason why we concentrate on that 24-hour storm is that's what a lot of the permitting agencies, right? That's the basis for a lot of our permits. That's a storm event that we look at. As we get into more detailed design, we'll take a look at some of the shorter frequency, and absolutely agree that the short, very intense rainfall is a problem, and but the additional hydraulic capacity that we're providing as a result of the improvements will certainly address some of that. Like I said, there's always going to be the bigger, heavier storm that taxes the capacity of the system, but the roadway will be able to open the traffic quicker. The impacts will be shorter. So that's the goal of the study, or the eventual design.
Good evening. Jürgen Kremer, I live on 6 Saltbox Lane East, right where the mess typically starts. My question, I'm a long-time resident there. I had 3 times floodings, not only in 2021, but also 15 years ago in my basement. And thanks for the study. I think it's a good point to start. But my main question is, where's the town on all of this? I mean, do we have funds allocated for repairs? It seems to be obvious that something needs to be done. And I mean, the 50-year solution seems to be the minimum what needs to be done according to the town's standards, as you pointed out. So where is the town on this? What is the timing? What's the money allocated?
Well, I can tell you that when we started this, right after the floods, the first selectman directed me to do certain things with a final goal, right? We weren't going to do these if there weren't going to be some results from the studies and things that we could put on the plate for the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the RTM to look at and say, these are good projects, they're cost effective, and we're going to implement them. So right now, we do have the money to do the design. I have the proposal already. I was waiting to sign off on anything like that until we had our meeting tonight, but, and I had just gotten it a week or two ago, so we're ready to get going. So we'll start the design, as long as the first selectman directs me, and I believe she will be. She's not holding me back on doing that. After which time we will work on an engineer's estimate, and as we get closer to the semifinal and final design, as according to Joe's schedule, we'll be presenting that to the Board of Selectmen for some type of funding, and to the Board of Finance, and then followed after that by the RTM. In that interim, there may be some opportunities for grants. There may be some resilient grants that we're going to go after too. That's something that I could take on and with Joe's help, put in submissions while we're going through the permitting process also. So those things will open up avenues for us too as we're going through this process. So I've been directed to move forward.
So just to understand this correctly, your timeline basically showed that it takes, let's say, a minimum of 3 years from the start of the design to end of construction, if I see this correct. So are you telling those 3 years periods would start right now, this period?
I'll say yes. Yeah, it does. And Joe and I talked about the schedule. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear any groans, but I groaned when I saw it. But that is following what we've seen from the DEEP, based on a lot of things, mostly retirements and new employees getting up to speed, making sure that we go to all the proper regulatory bodies. So those things, so that 6 to 9 months, I think was broad. I wish I could have narrowed it down for you folks a little bit better. And if we can do it sooner and get it done quicker, we will. We will. But I wanted to present something that was as realistic as we thought it could be.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Cynthia Ferrer. I live at 9 Thomasina Lane, and my house was the one that did get flooded. It was up there in the picture during both storms. So my question is, are we talking about agreement from the town to start with the recommendation, the 50-year solution that you presented? I just want to be clear on what is the town moving forward with?
The presentation of alternate 1A that he showed and highlighted with the box is the one that we recommend doing. Yes.
And that's the 50-year?
That's a 50-year storm.
Okay.
But what I had Joe do, and he showed this to you, was run the 100-year storm event through it. And what I wanted to make sure was happening is that there were no homes impacted by the floods.
Yep.
And that's what we came up with.
Yeah, okay. And then my second question is, given that this will take approximately 3 years from beginning to end, are there any interim solutions that could be some quick wins that could be considered just to alleviate the stress of potentially having another one of these storms in the next 3 years? Because that is, of course, my biggest concern. I know we've lived now 2 years, since almost 2 years in that time, and we've been okay, but is there anything that has been considered for that?
Well, you saw some of the constraints that Joe pointed out in the system that's out there. The one that I particularly have an issue with is the one at the intersection of Saltbox East and Saltbox, where it goes from a 30/24 to a 30. So we're going to take a look at that. If there's an opportunity for us to improve that flow capacity there to make it more consistent, where it's not a bottleneck, I think we're going to try to improve that there. That's one of the things we're looking at doing right now.
So my name is Christine Castles, and I live at 15 Dubois. My family's lived there for over 50 years. And other than just a very minor amount of, little wetness in the basement, there's been nothing until these storms where it was close to a foot in the basement. And at the beginning, you had touched upon behind the Presbyterian Church. So from Noroton Avenue, where they built some of those homes, and the drainage behind the Lawrence Funeral Home, all those trees have fallen. It's gotten very wet, and it seems like water's coming down the road. I'm not sure, but I'm like between that and Coach Lamp. The backyard's been severely flooded, and I'm wondering if your 1A or whatever plan that you have is going to help my area down there on Dubois. I don't know, you didn't directly address it, but I don't know if addressing the other flooding, if that's going to impact where we are as well.
Okay, and your property, is it near Patricia Lane or is it further near the Post Road?
Closer to the Post Road, about 4 houses up from the Post Road.
4 houses.
So, yeah, kind of the back of the Florence Funeral Home would, you know,
Okay.
if you go, you know, from that across.
Yeah, all right, so, yeah, what we looked at, we looked at, our alternate 1A, right, would resolve the 50-year flooding, attributable to the municipal drainage system. I'll have to take a closer look at a map, to really get a context for your property, so I'll have to get, see what the topography around there looks like. So I'll need to take a closer look at that. Unfortunately, I can't answer that directly today without taking a look at it. We'll just have to see what the impacts are, if it's like from the municipal system, if it's overland runoff, or if it's something from the state system. But the 1A design, right, does not have any flooding for the 50-year event. Sure.
Yeah, and my neighbor right next to me, I'm a little bit elevated in my house, so in the basement. They're on the street level. They had to try to put sandbags in front of their garage because the water was coming up their driveway so much going directly into their garage.
What
That would be 13. Number 13.
Oh, 13? Okay.
Oh, there you are, my neighbor. Oh, he's here. Good, I'm glad you came. Yeah, so he'll address that himself. Trying to help you out here.
Yeah, Adrian Tracy, I'm 13 Du Bois Street, Christine's neighbor. The pictures were, that's what happened September 1st on the street.
Okay.
Right, where the water runoff comes down the street and the drainage pipes in front of my house just get over.
Okay.
They can't take the load. So you get kind of that scenario where, we had there's probably maybe 4 inches in the garage and maybe equivalent in the basement.
Okay.
From what happened then.
All right.
And again,
So, yeah, that's
Christine, will you be doing anything to help me?
Yeah, right. Our analysis takes everything off the roadway. There's no flooding in the roadway, right? Because it looks like, it's coming in from the roadway. But if you don't mind, could you please send those photos to the Department of Public Works? And that way we can look at them and...
Have you got
Use them for our records when we start doing the design.
Sherry, could you write down the email address, and I'll happily send it over to you. Yeah. And again, I think to someone else's point, that happened over about, the picture I just showed you is midnight, so it happened between around 10:30 p.m. that night and midnight, and it dissipated really quickly off the road once the rain stopped,
Okay. All right. Good information. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris Smith, and I live at 18 Saltbox Lane. I want to thank Mr. Gentile for coming out in 2021 and walking through our backyards and really listening to us, and to the Board of Selectmen and the First Selectman for doing this study and putting this forward. I live on the east side of Saltbox Lane, and there's an easement. You describe it as a channel that comes back there. Does the water flow into that go away? Because a lot of the houses on the east side and the south side of Saltbox Lane East got heavily flooded from the overflow of that.
Right. Yeah, so you're talking about the channel that runs behind the properties on the east side of Saltbox, right?
Right.
It's picked up and then piped into Saltbox Lane a little bit further to the south,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things, right, as part of our more detailed survey, we have to take a look to see if that is actually, qualifies as a wetland, because that'll impact how we address that. Similar to the Seagate watercourse situation, right? We might need to maintain a certain level of flow in there. But what happens is that Saltbox Lane East intersection starts to fill, some of that water backflows into that small drainage system that contributes to this, that channel. Remember those green lines that went into that channel there? So you get that backflow. So what would happen, this would, alternate 1A would help in that you have the additional piping capacity, right? You don't have that flooding situation in the intersection, so you're not getting that backflow situation where that, as the floodwaters build, right, they kind of bypass and work their way around. That won't happen. So yeah, you'll definitely see less flow in that channel. But the question is, I don't think we can eliminate all flow to that. I think there's a high probability that some of that might be identified as a wetland, based on the underlying soil type, which is something we'll look at when we send a field crew out there for the survey, or to send a soil scientist out to take a look at where potential wetlands.
My other question was maybe for the town. Is there any room for lobbying for the 100-year storm proposal, given that, the increase in frequency and severity of storms, to put all this money into it and then be behind, in terms of what it can hold?
There's a couple of restrictions, and it's not just cost, but it's also the benefit that goes along with it. And also looking at the size of the outlet pipe that has to come down Salt Box, the restrictions with other utilities right there and crossing the post road, when we started to look at it, it kind of took us away from that design. We would be having to either move utilities or end up going to dual smaller pipes, which just makes the efficiency even worse with the propensity of it backing up onto Salt Box again.
So it would be more than the 1.2 million proposal, because you'd also be moving.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So there was like was it to go from 50 to 100 year was about $1.2 million different in the proposal, but that wouldn't include.
It was around $1 million or so different, but as we showed you, and the reason I had Joe run the 100-year storm event was to show you that as these storms start to increase in the frequency and the changes in our design parameters for a 100-year storm being 8 inches instead of 7, which it used to be 50 years ago, was to see what impact a 100-year storm event would have. And with it having minimal effects on just the roadways, we're actually getting a 100-year design storm construction out of this 50-year design criteria.
Okay, thank you.
That answers your question.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Hi, Nick Bizzuto. I'm 12 Saltbox Lane. Oh, a little loud? Okay. And thank you guys for putting on the proposal. We had to go through some significant renovations to our house on the back of the flooding issues. So I'm very keen to see something come through so our new renovations don't experience that again. I think it's probably worth noting that the audience that's here today, just for the record, and how important this is and how many people have been affected. So thank you on that. I was hoping if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how you selected like 1A in the findings. To me, it wasn't like clearly obvious why that was significantly better than all the other ones, but it seems like that was kind of the way that we're heading. I'm not just arguing it, but I would just be curious to understand why you think that's the superior proposal.
Sure, right. We had 4 principal alternatives that we looked at, and the 25-year one, that met the town requirements, but it didn't offer a whole lot of protection, right? So that's why we kind of put that one aside. The alternate 2, which is the one that brought it down the post road, there were a lot of issues with that permitting wise, a lot of construction challenges. That we put that one aside. So we were really essentially left with alternate 1A, which was 50-year design, and 1C, which was the 100-year design. And the key to this, right, was saying, okay, what is, we absolutely must protect the residences from being impacted, where we don't want floodwaters in the homes, right? And that alternate 1A achieved that for the 50-year design. And also, even though it's a 50-year design, when we ran the 100 through there was also no impacts to the homes. Right now, the box culvert, the spine of the system going down Salt Box, that is a 3x5 box culvert. Whereas in the 100-year design, that is a 3x7. So as Ed had said earlier, right, the impacts from that extra 2 feet are enormous, right? Because it would impinge on the sanitary sewer in the street, whereas the 3x5 is more compact, right? Because it's not, when we give these dimensions, that's the inside dimension. Right, so a bigger, wider culvert is going to have wider walls. So where the 3x5, probably, you assume a foot on each side, that becomes 7 feet wide, but the 3 by 7, right, because of the wall thickness, right, because it's a bigger span, because 7 feet wide, not 5, that span becomes 10 feet. And the roadway width is like 22 feet, so half the roadway would be taken up by that drainage pipe. So all the utilities on one side of the roadway would need to be relocated to the other. Then you have to redo all the connections, for the sanitary sewer. So there are a lot of construction impacts which would really drive up the cost of the project. And then compared, to the benefit, what's the benefit? Like I said, that 6% reduction in flooded area. It just didn't seem to make sense. It really didn't seem that like there was any payback there. So that's why we selected the alternate 1A.
Got it. And one follow-up question: did you, you mentioned Hurricane Ida was a 250-year event, but we didn't really stress it through you didn't stress it through a 250-year event, did you? Is it possible that you looked at that as what would happen in that event?
Right.
Because I think you just did a 50 and 100 year under that proposal. I'm curious if we went through September 2021 again, what that would look like. Because I don't think we simulated that.
Right. I don't think we didn't specifically run that Hurricane Ida, the September 2021 event through there. There would be flooding. I suppose that's something we could do and take a look at and see what the impacts are. But, that storm was just so abnormally large. It was, very intense. It wiped out some roads in North Stamford. So it was a very unusual rainfall event. And typically, you wouldn't design for something that large. That's why, we always looked at the 100. But that's something, we could look at later on and see what the impacts are. But unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the study. My name's Tom Bradle. I live on that corner of Saltbox and Saltbox East. My home was featured prominently in many of your photographs. Dubious honor. I didn't have a question actually about the plan, but about the stopgap measures that might be taken. 3 years, maybe more with delays is a long time, no matter what we do. But I think for the hot spots, those acute areas, something can be done, either with pumping or sandbagging of nearby homes, even towing cars, some kind of protocol. We're going to get flooded with those heavy rain events. So we had an incident on our street, I don't know if you're aware, where someone, unaware that the water was rising so quickly, obviously they could see it was raining, they backed into the water with a young child in the back seat, needed to be evacuated by the neighbor. This is like an emergency drowning situation on our street. And I don't know, I would just like to see a truck down there, a cop down there, tow truck down there, public works folks, something, while we wait, But thanks for all your hard work.
And let me say a few things too, and I want you to folks to understand that I am acutely aware of the things that happen throughout town. I happened to get in here just as it was starting to come down, and I spent most of the night through this whole thing. But we had, just so you know, we had about 9 feet of water in the DPW garage. I watched that thing go underwater. I watched it reside. I watched Saltbox. I was over on Stony Brook. I was literally all over the place, but what you need to understand, and I was at the Stony Brook pump station just hoping that the water did not go over the top of the transformer and us lose that pump station. So what I'm doing now for my facilities, I've made some changes. I don't store the expensive equipment in the basement anymore at the DPW garage, okay? I put anything I store down there on a trailer or with the ability to start the engine and drive out. I've been watching the rainfall predictions religiously. Stony Brook pump station, the same thing. I'm hardening the the pump station where flood dams for the doors. I'm enclosing the transformer. I am raising the generator. All of those things to help prevent flooding again. And there are probably some things that you folks can do, but I tell you, that storm that we got in September, I've never seen anything like it. We were just the town of Darien just had a lot of water that it had to deal with. It's just not a systems, no systems are designed to handle that.
No, I appreciate that. I just remember one thing that might be important when you talk about pump stations and their capacity and whether they're down and how many we have online. I can tell you during I've been there 22 years and I've watched it with fascination. It always swells in the same spot. But the very curious thing about it is 3 feet of water will drain in 10 minutes, as if a pump went on, you know? And I don't know if that's pertinent to your study or something you didn't know, but something happens. And I don't think it's just a natural...
the intersection of your
that
house?
intersection that...
Right where that 24-inch
Yep.
is?
Yep.
Hi there. My name's Carrie Vomaka. I'm at 24 Saltbox Lane. So I am the other house that you could see in all of those pictures at that corner. And I want to thank you for all the work that's been done. We moved in 2020 and we deliberately bought a house that was not in the floodplain because I lived on Long Island Sound in Stamford before this. And so it was quite terrifying, I will say, to watch those waters coming up as rapidly as they did. So I just echo my neighbor who just spoke that anything that you can do in the interim, you know, especially on our corner lot. I was very afraid with my children, like if we were trapped or if something was happen, that we would not be able, you know, to have emergency services. So thank you for taking so much care. I do actually have one question, which is, when you went through the presentation and you talked about how we're talking here about 1.5%, I think, of that whole big area. And I would just love to understand how this is being looked at. I know it's somewhat out of scope, but there's a lot of water that's coming down, right? And it's not just our street. So, you know, are you looking at addressing things outside of this area that can also help?
Okay, so to answer your question about, just to clarify on the area that contributes to Holly Pond, right? The area that contributes to the Saltbox Lane drainage system is that 125 acres. It's that red outline study area. That yellow highlighting, right? Because the Norotan River also comes down into Holly Pond. We just want to show that there's a large watershed area that contributes to Holly Pond, of which the Saltbox Lane area is a portion of, but we just wanted to show that there's a much larger area that comes in into Holly Pond. The Saltbox Lane area, that drainage system, you know, anything that's outside of that red box goes into other drainage systems, so it doesn't go through Saltbox, but everything in that yellow goes to Holly Pond.
Hi, Bill Wright, Seagate Road. There's 19 homes on Seagate Road that we're a little concerned about. We get all the water and want to make sure that we didn't have any major issues. You've handled a lot of them tonight. I appreciate that. One of the biggest concerns was Post Road, Saltbox Lane, everything coming down, and then we have that fine little stream there that went wild as well and flooded a couple homes. But we still need to maintain some water on it normally. It is a water course and EPC regulated and all. So that's appreciate you looking into that, and you dug up some research that we were hopeful for. The second matter is the inlet. So we understand Holly Pond can handle all the water, but we're really focusing on that Seagate Inlet, which is, you know, a beautiful piece. Everybody looks at it. It's recreational, waterfowl, and all that. So that was our concern, that didn't get degraded during this operation. We totally understand the water needs to be pulled out of upstream of us and relieve these flooding victims north of us, totally. So the talk of the cofferdam was really important to us because there was history, and long before you're here, in 1973 when the sewers were put in, the town didn't handle the contractors well. During major rainstorms, the washout of these open excavations totally filled up our inlet in Holly Pond. The town at the time pointed fingers all over the place. In 1986, we had to dredge it all out as a community down at the inlet in order so it still looks good today and it doesn't turn into a delta. So we don't want that to happen again. I know everybody tries to do their best not to have excavation washouts, but it can happen. And so the idea that you're accepting our thoughts of some kind of cofferdam to handle that during that period, if it comes down, it drops there, and then you can excavate it out from the shore, would be wonderful. So that's one of our biggest concerns, and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate all the good input from the folks down there. And when we start looking at that inlet down there and discharge area, we, of course, we're going to probably need a cofferdam. We're going to do some dredging there. We'll probably, and most likely, need to test the soils that are there to get rid of them. So we'll be doing some dredging at the end of that outlet.
And you have our
before and after
use of our land right there, which is owned by the number of people there to do anything you want to pull material.
And I wish I could tell you that we have a great contractor and we're ready to go, but I don't know that. But as we go through the process of selecting one, as we always do, or as I always do, making sure that they're qualified to be doing the work that they're doing, and we'll have an eye on them. I have in the past, in the projects I've worked here in Darien, have always got good responses from the Darien residents as they watch the projects go along too. And I think that's important too.
Can I ask just one?
Sure.
Sorry, one other little add-on to that. Your sense was if this is a larger culvert that it won't have as much velocity when it hits the inlet. Because it is shallow, it's another concern of ours. Once we pull out all that cofferdam and everything else, if you get a big storm and the velocity and volume comes down, it will then push the sediment level and then actually create a delta or a shoal or something right in the middle of that inlet. And so I don't know how to engineer that so that wouldn't happen. Do you have riprap that goes out further so that it diffuses some of that velocity, or are you not worried about that velocity doing that?
Yeah, we reduced, right, because our culvert's wider, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our volume's not increasing. The velocity gets less. But in terms of, I think your concern is like the sediment buildup at that outlet.
Yeah, not as much coming down because it's a closed system. I'm not worried about that, and especially since Ed does a lot of sump removals all along the basin, so we don't get that sands, gravels much in the closed system. Right. But what's already there, which is heavy muds and stuff, if it's pushed, it'll then just rise up further away where we have a dock and mooring and boats, and we have this big hump there. If we don't control that velocity, is my concern.
Right, yeah, and that's something that we would look at in detailed design, right? As part of the outfall replacement, right? We have to take basically a boring to get understand what the gradation of the material, how finely graded the particle size is, right? And that gives us an idea of what kind of level of scour we could expect there, that what'll move out, and then based on that, we can come up with some countermeasures if necessary to avoid that sediment, washout at the outlet.
I mean, it's possible you could have a pad, and then further out you could have some kind of a little lower. I guess they use these rock. Where they put them all in. What's that word? I can't remember. They kind of like a preformed scour hole or something. Yeah, but it's actually more of a small barrier where they fill these screens full of rocks, and so that the velocity could hit that too, and drop out some of the.
Yeah.
What's that word? I'm not sure what it's called, but so we can talk about this further in our own private discussion, but that's one of our concerns is that we don't get that sediment pushed out and then the area becomes unusable.
Right. One of the things that we'll have to be careful of with the energy dissipation, right, we'll have to take a close look at that, is DEP is generally resistant to putting riprap. So we might have to do boulders or, something vegetative, but, as part of the final design, we'll work out those details.
Right, got it. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Hi there, Karen Wichman. I'm at 52 Coachland Lane. So we were a little bit surprised when we first looked through the report to see that we weren't highlighted at all in any of the impacted areas, and certainly not one of the ones that was highlighted as a property being directly impacted by any of the events, because we've had two pretty significant flooding events in our home in the last 10 or so years. And so we were wondering whether or not this plan will impact at all sort of adjacent lots that may not be directly affected by the overground water that's coming in and flooding, but it seems like our two flooding events happened when we had seepage from below because the water table got so high, and there was so much ground saturation that it literally came in from below our house. and contributed to significant damage, lots of repairs and all of that. So would this have any impact, would it sort of dry out the surrounding areas at all and help with maybe houses that didn't appear as directly impacted there, but obviously have flooding issues? I mean, our backyard is a swamp after major, rain events, and it takes forever to drain.
Okay, yeah, and you said you were at 52? Okay, and I'm trying to envision, that's further, like, around the corner?
We back onto Saltbox East.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll have to take a closer look at that. Unfortunately, I just can't envision the topography right now, but we'll take a look at that and get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, my name is June Harden. I live at 50 Coach Lamp Lane next door to Karen. And we have always had flooding. I've lived there 42 years, and Coach Lamp has always flooded before Saltbox. Now, what is going to be done about Coach Lamp?
Okay, yeah, just as a clarification, right, I know we concentrated a lot on Saltbox, but we are also making improvements at 1A alternate, also increases the pipe sizes in Coach Lamp. In fact, it goes all the way back up to Thomasina, so that basically all the pipes in that study area, that 125 acres, which includes Coach Lamp, those will all be upgraded.
Because the water comes down from Gardner Street and off the post road, and you can see it coming, and it settles right at my driveway. And the police have been there, they've roped it off. This has gone on for 42 years, and nothing has been done. And you talk about Saltbox Lane, and it seems like, thank heavens I wasn't home when the storm came, but something needs to be done on Coach Lamp because the water cannot drain.
Yeah, agreed. And the proposed alternate does replace the pipes on Coach Lamp as well.
Oh, it's all going to be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, on Coach Lamp, the easements, where that connect Thomasina to Coach Lamp.
Yes, that's where I live.
Right, that'll be replaced too. And actually, our model did show that area as one of the first to flood.
Because I have walked around my home, and the water would be over knee deep. And this was before these storms. So something really needs to be done on Coach Lamp, and it will help Saltbox.
Right, yeah, both.
Yes,
definitely
it will
need
help
attention.
all.
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
My name is Rolf Obin, 9 Archer Lane. I don't live in the area where this study was conducted. I am a member of the Public Works, RTM Public Works Committee. Just a couple of comments and observations and maybe a couple of questions. My comments somewhat have already been said, but just to reiterate, it appears to me that, yes, this area in particular is a victim of what appears to have been a series of drainage works that were put in over the course of time and were kind of maybe not planned out as well as they could have been. And you combine that with the increasing intensity of storms and the amount of rainfall that we're getting now, it really exacerbated the situation there. So I certainly recommend that we go forward with this on the 50-year standard, okay? Which leads me to one of my questions, which is, when will you be able to go forward to present this to the Board of Selectmen? How does that work in the calendar? Is that something that can be in the next Board of Selectmen meeting that you would present this? So that's one question. And then the other observation that I have is that working on the sewer commission, the Arcadis, where we're now going to phase 2, a lot of that project is geared towards reducing the amount of I&I that we have coming to drainage and also into soil, okay? But as we tighten up on the sewer lines, that water, I think something like 300 million rather, gallons that goes into the sewage processing that's really not sewage affluent. So that water is going to have to go somewhere. I assume some of it's going to go into the ground, but I also assume some of it's going to go into our drainage systems. And so I foresee that as adding more demand to our drainage in general throughout the town. And so I think that's something that we should take into consideration, not only for this project, but for any project going into the future. I am very interested to hear about the report relative to the Tilly Pond watershed. And that was authorized in February of last year. We're now May of this year, so I'm hoping that that's going to be coming up in the near future. And after that, I really don't have much more else to say.
As I said, we do have the funds ready for the design to get started, and I have the proposal. Once I speak with the first selectman after this meeting, she tells me to go ahead, I will move forward. And I have a high level of confidence that she's going to direct me to move forward. All right, so that will start the design. We'll start with Joe. As far as the Tilly Pond study, we do have that 99% final. We'll actually have a meeting in 2 weeks with the stakeholders to review the results, see if there's anything else we'd like to see done with the results, kind of like what we did with this study here. Run a model at a certain type of storm. Let's see what happens. Is there any improvements that we can bypass around, things like that. And that's when this discussion is going to happen, and we'll finalize that report over the next 2 months or so.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Folks, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been great. It was a great turnout. I didn't think I was going to get many, but I do appreciate you folks. And like we said, we will continue to move this forward as quickly as I possibly can. If we can cut some of that timeline down, we will. All right. Have a very good night. Thank you once again.